April 25th, 1846. The muddy waters of the Rio Grande swirled around the legs of Captain Seth Thornton's dragoons as they pushed into the dense chaparral north of the river. The air, thick with the scent of desert bloom and tension, suddenly crackled with the report of musketry. From the thorny brush, Mexican cavalry erupted, sabres gleaming. In the frantic skirmish that followed, 16 Americans fell, dead or captured. Thornton had stumbled into an ambush on land his commander claimed was American. To Mexico, he was a trespasser on sovereign soil. That single, bloody encounter on the disputed plains of Texas lit the fuse of a war that would redraw the map of a continent and haunt the conscience of a nation. The conflict that appeared to explode from that April skirmish had been simmering for a generation. It was a clash born from a collision of two expanding republics, each viewing the other with a mixture of disdain, suspicion, and territorial ambition. The United States, young, brash, and pulsing with what it saw as its manifest destiny, gazed upon the northern provinces of Mexico, vast, sparsely populated, and rich in land, as a natural inheritance. Mexico, born from its own bloody war for independence from Spain, was fragile, politically fractured, and deeply suspicious of its northern neighbours' relentless growth. The immediate spark was Texas. For Mexico, the 1836 secession of Texas was an act of piracy, a rebellion by ungrateful American immigrants who had been granted land only to steal the province itself. The memory of the Alamo and San Jacinto was a raw national wound. For the United States, Texas was a brave sister republic, its annexation in 1845 a simple act of union. When President James K. Polk, a fervent expansionist, sent troops under General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande, a boundary Mexico vehemently disputed, claiming the traditional border was the Nueces River. Over 100 miles to the north, he was not merely defending territory, he was provoking a war. Polk's war message to Congress spoke of American blood upon American soil. But on the floor of the House, a first-term representative from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln rose to challenge the very premise, introducing his spot resolutions demanding to know the exact spot where Thornton's men had fallen and whether it was truly US territory. His skepticism was shared by other northern intellectuals, like a young Henry David Thoreau, who went to jail in protest, writing that, "Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison." While politicians debated in Washington, the war on the ground began with a series of stunning American victories. Old rough and ready Zachary Taylor, a career soldier with the demeanour of a rumpled farmer, defeated a larger Mexican force at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, driving them back across the Rio Grande. His troops, a mix of regulars and volunteers, were tough, disciplined, and armed with the flying artillery, light mobile cannons that could be rapidly repositioned to devastating effect. The Mexican army, brave but hampered by outdated equipment and a rigid European-style command structure, could not withstand the storm of shot and shell. By September 1846, Taylor had pushed deep into northern Mexico, capturing the strategic city of Monterrey after a brutal house-to-house battle. The cost of conquest was becoming clear, not just in the bodies left on the field, but in the character of the occupying army. Volunteer regiments, often ill-disciplined, committed atrocities against Mexican civilians, fueling a bitter hatred that would long outlast the war. But Polk, frustrated with Taylor's growing political popularity and the stalemate in the north, had already set a grander strategy in motion. He turned to General Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers, a brilliant, vainglorious, and supremely competent commander. Scott conceived one of the most audacious amphibious operations in military history. A naval fleet would land an army on the Mexican coast, march inland, and besiege the hallowed halls of the enemy capital itself, Mexico City. The campaign began on the dunes of Veracruz in March 1847. Over 10,000 American soldiers poured onto the beaches in a single day, a spectacle of immense logistical power. They laid siege to the fortified city, bombarding it for days until its surrender. The victory was decisive, but it came with a new horror: yellow fever. The vomito negro, black vomit, would prove as deadly an enemy as the Mexican army. From the coastal lowlands, Scott's army began its epic march into the volcanic highlands, following the path of the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés. They were a thin blue line climbing into the clouds, hundreds of miles from their supply base, surrounded by a hostile population and a gathering Mexican army. It was a breathtaking gamble. Waiting for them in the mountain passes was the one man who could unite and inspire Mexico, General Antonio López de Santa Anna. The charismatic, cunning, and often disastrous leader had returned from exile promising victory. He chose a formidable defensive position at Cerro Gordo, a mountain pass he declared impregnable. "If the birds of the air can pass, then so can the Americans," he boasted. He was wrong. Captain Robert E. Lee of the U.S. Army Engineers, in a feat of brilliant reconnaissance, found a path that allowed American troops to flank the entire Mexican position. The resulting battle was a rout. Santa Anna fled so quickly, he left behind his wooden leg and a chest of gold. The road to Mexico City lay open. As Scott's army closed on the Capital Valley, the political and moral fissures back in the United States widened. The question of what to do with the territory being won, specifically whether slavery would be permitted there, began to poison the national discourse. The war, for many, was no longer a glorious adventure but a sinister plot to extend the slave power. Outside Mexico City, the young Mexican government, in a state of perpetual crisis, deposed Santa Anna, only to reappoint him to command. He prepared a final, desperate defense, marshalling his forces at the Churubusco River Convent. The Americans attacked head-on in a bloody close-quarters fight. The Mexican defenders, including a brave battalion of Irish-American deserters, the San Patricios, fought with the fury of men who knew this was their last stand. The Battle of Churubusco was a slaughter. American victory was certain, but the cost was immense. Seeking to avoid a final, street-by-street battle for the capital, Scott agreed to an armistice. It was a fleeting hope. The Mexican government, racked by internal divisions, rejected American peace terms, and the war machine lurched forward once more. The final acts were among the bloodiest. At the fortress of Molino del Rey, American troops launched a costly frontal assault based on flawed intelligence, suffering nearly 800 casualties in a battle of questionable strategic value. The war's brutal logic seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The climax came at the castle of Chapultepec, the military academy on a hill that guarded the city's gates. On September 13th, 1847, Winfield Scott ordered the final assault. The defenders were a desperate collection of Mexican cadets and soldiers. As the American storming parties scaled the walls, the legendary Niños Heroes, boy heroes, the young cadets, fought to the death. One, according to the enduring national legend, wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leaped from the ramparts rather than surrender. As Chapultepec fell. The following day, American troops marched into the Zócalo, the Grand Central Plaza of Mexico City. After a war of nearly 2 years and over 1,000 miles of marching, the American flag flew over the halls of Montezuma. The military victory was complete, but the peace would be dictated as much by politics in Washington as by the occupation in Mexico. To negotiate that peace, President Polk sent a thin, consumptive State Department clerk named Nicholas Trist. Falling out of favor with Polk, who recalled him, Trist ignored the order. Believing the war immoral and that the US was already demanding too much, he nonetheless sat down with the Mexican delegation in the suburb of Guadalupe Hidalgo to draft a treaty. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, was a document of staggering consequence. Mexico ceded over 500,000 square miles of territory, what would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The United States agreed to pay $15 million and assume the claims of its citizens against Mexico. For the United States, it was the fulfillment of manifest destiny. The national domain increased by a third, granting it ports on the Pacific and untold mineral wealth. It was, in the words of the New York journalist John L. O'Sullivan, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. For Mexico, it was the desmembración nacional, national dismemberment. It lost half its territory in a single stroke. The loss was a profound national trauma that would define Mexican identity, politics, and its relationship with the United States for centuries. The border had been drawn, but a deep psychological scar remained. The returning American armies brought with them a new class of battle-hardened officers whose experience would soon be turned against one another. The names read like a roll call for the coming Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, William T. Sherman, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis. They learned the art of war in Mexico, lessons they would apply with devastating effect on American soil just 13 years later. Grant, who served with distinction under both Taylor and Scott, later reflected with profound regret, "I was bitterly opposed to the measure, the annexation of Texas, and to this day regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation." The war also reshaped the social fabric of the new American Southwest. The approximately 80,000 Mexicans who lived in the ceded territories were promised U.S. citizenship and property rights under the treaty. In reality, they often faced discrimination, land dispossession, and a long, difficult struggle to secure their place within a new and often hostile nation. The discovery of gold in California just 9 days before the treaty was ratified sent a tsunami of humanity westward, accelerating the Americanization of the newly won lands and marginalizing the Californios who had been there for generations. The promise of Guadalupe Hidalgo was for many broken before the ink was dry. The political fallout was immediate and toxic. The question of whether slavery would be allowed in the new territories exploded the delicate balance of power in Congress. The Wilmot Proviso, which sought to ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico, became a rallying cry for abolitionists and a nightmare for Southern slaveholders. The debates grew so fierce that South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun declared that the Union could not be preserved if the North used its power to exclude slavery from the West. The Mexican-American War had not only expanded the nation, it had supplied the powder keg that would soon ignite the Civil War. In Mexico, the humiliation of defeat led to a period of intense internal reflection and renewed conflict. It discredited the conservative leadership and paved the way for the La Reforma, a liberal movement that sought to remake the nation. The loss solidified a deep-seated Mexican nationalism, defined in part by resistance to American power. The legacy of the war is a study in contrasting memories. In the United States, it is often a forgotten war, sandwiched between 1812 and 1861, its battlefields largely unknown. The legacy of the war is a study in contrasting memories. In the United States, it is often a forgotten war, sandwiched between 1812 and 1861, its battlefields largely unknown. In Mexico, September 13th is a day of national mourning, commemorating the Niños Heroes of Chapultepec. The war is remembered not as a footnote, but as a foundational trauma, a defining moment of national resistance against a colossus to the north. The border created by the war has never been a simple line on a map. It is a living, often painful seam where two nations, two cultures, and two economies grind against one another. The tensions of migration, trade, and sovereignty that play out today are direct descendants of the conflict of 1846 to 48. The Mexican-American War stands as a stark lesson in the uses of power and the price of expansion. It demonstrated the stunning military potential of the United States while simultaneously exposing the deep moral and political fissures that expansion could create. It was a war where American valor on the battlefield coexisted with political cynicism in Washington, where the genius of generals like Scott and Lee was matched by the brutality of volunteer soldiers against civilians. It was, like all wars, a story of contradiction. The conflict that began with Thornton's ambush on the Rio Grande ended with a treaty in a quiet suburb. It gave the United States its geographical majesty, but burdened its soul with the questions of empire and the stain of an unjust cause, questions that would be answered only in the fire of a civil war. In the end, the Mexican-American War forged two modern nations, but in crucibles of fire and sacrifice. It drew a boundary not just of territory, but of memory. One nation's forgotten victory is another's enduring wound, a testament to the fact that the maps drawn by conquerors can never fully erase the blood spilled upon the land.